And good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining in on next month, actually. March 4 is the exact day, is the 160th anniversary of Abraham Lincoln's inaugural address at a time of intense stress in the country. It's 1861, you know what's happening a month later, April 12, Fort Sumter. And Lincoln is going to allude to things of this nature in this address. But what's fascinating about this address, in fact, I just gave a talk this morning on George Washington's farewell address, which is 225 years ago in September of this year. And two things come to mind here right off the bat. The idea of union, the country, togetherness, which I'm sure some of you people are probably going to say is being called into question right now. George Washington thought, and I brought it up just in case I need it, that union is what can hold the country together. It made no difference whether you're from the north, the south, the east, the west, that each section of the country brought something to the table to justify and solidify and preserve union. Perhaps for the Southerners, it's cotton, tobacco, sugar, rice. Those were real big export crops. Up in the north, the Hamiltonian notion of industrialization and finance is beginning to take root. And that will, where is that going to go eventually, right? America's going to become an industrialized state. The Eastern Seaboard, the ports, shipping, go west, and we are developing west. That's going to be the big story of this country with Manifest Destiny. The things, there's farmers there growing crops, but how about skins and furs? That's a growing market. And so you see, as George Washington states, that union is what ought to generate love of the country, love of union, love of Republican government. And so Lincoln is offering union as well. And he's the 16th president. And so interesting what he states here. And this farewell address is really worth the read. I think I forwarded it to Catherine. So if you folks would like a copy, I'm sure she can give you one. Or if you want, you can even contact me. I can always send it to you too, which is not a problem. In fact, Catherine is free to give away my email addresses for those. But make sure if you're going to email me, you reference the Danbury Library. Make sure you do that so I know. But I'd be glad to send you that, or if the George Washington's farewell address, if you want that one, and other stuff that I got, if you have requests. And this is one of the first ports of call for Lincoln. Apprehension seems to exist among the people of the southern states that by the accession of Republican administration, Republican Party, keep in mind, at one time he was a Whig, their property, their peace, and personal security are to be endangered. He refutes this right off the bat. You know, keep in mind, let's stick to one aspect of this, property. You know, Lincoln's not stupid. He understands the country was formed on the ownership of private property. Now, keep in mind, this is 1861. Marx and Engels have already published the manifesto of the Communist Party, or what's known as the Communist Manifesto, but it's really the manifesto of the Communist Party, and they refute private property. Now, Lincoln understands that this country was formed on private property. I got that stuff too when I was in school. Liberty, freedom, democracy. Number one, we were founded as a republic, not a democracy, so forget that right off the bat. But this liberty, human rights, civil rights, no, it's all based on property. It's all based on, we were founded on economic liberty. They tried that at the front with the French Revolution and it failed. It failed. There's a number of reasons why that failed, and that's beyond this conversation. But we were founded on economic liberty. He's trying to assure these people below the Mason-Dixon line that the Republican administration, his, is no threat to property. It's no threat to property is sacrosanct in this country. It's sacred. It's sacred. In fact, go back to the post-Revolutionary War period when places like states, well, colonies, which are going to be states like New York, was absconding or kicking off their property, Tories and Loyalists. You know, they lost the war, the heck with them. We're going to take their property. Alexander Hamilton, a proponent of maintaining property, would defend these people in court, the people who lost, to keep their land. He said, if we are not wedded to property, then why do we fight the revolution for? This is what Lincoln is trying to, he's trying to soothe these people. We don't want your land. And yet, you know, when you go below the Mason-Dixon line, let's understand something here. This idea of the Southern plantation owners, the landed gentry of the United States, the practitioners here of agrarian capitalism. That's what they are. Or if you want to call them what they were also, concentration camp commanders. You know, this idea that they were the real defenders of states' rights, that they were the real defenders of the Constitution. Yet read the Southern Constitution and you will find slavery is glorified here. A Southerner can move anywhere he wants in any of the Confederate states, and he can take his slaves with him. You don't find that in the U.S. Constitution, despite the 3/5 compromise. And that's, again, another discussion. But here you are seeing the development of the saving of agrarian capitalism, but from the perspective of the Southern aristocracy, the Southern boyars, which was, if you want to use that term, that was the Russian landed gentry. I use that term periodically. And so what you're seeing in the South is the revolt of the planters. That's what the Confederacy was, a revolt of the Southern aristocracy. It's a revolt from the right, not from the left. Yet, interestingly enough, and Lincoln's going to understand this, that eventually he calls for 75,000 militiamen to volunteer, but by the end of the war, this will be an industrialized, corporatized war, something the Southerners aren't going to be able to win. That's beyond where we're going, but that's what's coming here. But he's trying to reassure these Southerners that I am not a threat to your property. Interesting what he has here too, in maintaining the structural integrity of the states. And this is what he offers. It is found in nearly all published speeches of him who now addresses you. This is Lincoln. You know, he says here, there has never been any reasonable cause for such apprehension. Danger to property. Indeed, the most ample evidence to the contrary has all the while existed and has open to their inspection, the people who feel otherwise. It is found in nearly all the published speeches of him who now addresses you, meaning himself. I do but quote from one of the speeches when I declare that I have no purpose, get this, no purpose directly or indirectly to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so. And since I have no inclination to do so. Those who have nominated and elected me did so with full knowledge that I made this in similar declarations, and have never recanted them. And so more than this, they place in the platform for my acceptance and as law to themselves and to me, the clear and emphatic resolution to which I now read. In other words, the inviolate rights of the states' rights. And so what he's telling these Southerners, again, not only property, that he is a champion of states' rights. You know, when you go back to what I mentioned just a couple of minutes ago about calling up militiamen, you know, and of course they're going to build a large regular army. That's a hallmark of an industrialized state. And this is where you're going to go eventually. Look what we have now. The idea of the Second Amendment has been dead a long time ago. We don't have a well-regulated militia. The National Guard is a bona fide reserve of the United States Army. The 1792 Militia Act was superseded by the 1903 National Guard Act. There is no well-regulated militia. It's gone, been gone, and it's been gone over a century. Well, we don't seem to want to talk about that with regards to the Second Amendment. I reiterate that these sentiments in so doing only press upon the public attention the most conclusive evidence of which the case is susceptible, that property, peace, and security are of no section are to be endangered by the now upcoming administration. Again, he's trying to reinforce that. He's trying to head off, not just secession, what they're going to call a civil war. That's what he wants to try to head off. I add to that all the protection which, consistently with the Constitution and the laws can have given, which will be cheerfully given to all the states when lawfully demanded, and for whatever cause, as cheerfully to one section as to another, yet at the same time, in fact, this is even happening now in the state of Maryland, right? State of Maryland, there are many Southern sympathizers. Harriet Tubman came from a plantation, slave owners from Maryland. She wasn't from the Deep South. She was from Maryland, Harriet Tubman, or Araminta Ross was her real name. That's what the name she was founded with. Harriet Tubman comes later. But she's from Maryland. In fact, that night, his personal protection, they had to make sure that at times he took a train at night through Maryland because they didn't want him opened up to assassination attempts. So it's a very sticky situation in the country. The issue of slaves being returned to their owners. Interesting it is, and again, he is not at odds with this. He's not seeking to abolish slavery, but let's understand something. As the war goes on, this notion of the Emancipation Proclamation here. In fact, you can see here women, and this is interesting because now I'm going to bring this up as an offshoot here. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony helped form the National Loyalty League. This was really the first women's political party from the perspective. There were 5,000 ladies in this, 5,000. And their big stick here is not just women's rights, voting rights. They are going to put together a petition. And this is going to help put pressure on the administration, petition. And 2,000 of these ladies fan out over the North. They generate signatures, 400,000 of them in support of freeing the slaves, Emancipation Proclamation. 400,000 signatures is the most successful petition ever put together in the history of the United States up to that point, 1862, 1863. So the pressure will be on. And at this point, why not? If the Southerners, if the Confederacy, and I'm going to get to Lincoln here, Grant in just a few minutes, if we're now generating not just a civil war, but this is becoming an industrialized war. This notion of defending states' rights, that went out the window because the Richmond government is going to become a strong central government. And Southerners are going to be stuck with that. And so this notion of them being the defenders of states' rights, the defenders of the Constitution, having states with independent governments, that dies in April 1862. It's over in a year. It's over in a year. Vast changes are coming. And Lincoln is going to have to move with these changes. He will have to abide by this, the emancipation of slaves. Why? Well, let's understand something. Let's look at this not from a humanitarian perspective, from an economic perspective. We're a capitalist state, first and foremost. That's America's state religion. And so interesting here, what you see is that the reality here is, take away the slaves, what happens to the Southern economy? It's over. There was a man by the name of DeBow, and this is like 20, 30 years before the war started. He was from New Orleans, I believe. He was a businessman who thought the South ought to diversify their economy, become industrialized, will maintain the plantations, but become industrialized as well. That's the last thing Northern businessmen want to hear. They're putting together a Northern industrial interest, and they're going to pay people to work in these factories. Now, if they're going to industrialize down South, who do you think some of the laborers will be working in those factories? Slaves, perhaps? You think they're going to pay them? You'll have a working class, a fledgling working class. Of course, the war starts this. So it's interesting what Lincoln, as we go along here during the war, gravitates toward. The idea of salvage not being involved in the slave issue dies. The economic realities of war and, wishful idealism, I don't care who it is, wishful idealism is usually trumped by real politics. And that's where you're going to go here. That's exactly where you're going to go. There is some difference of opinion whether this clause, in other words, made the swear, but in other words, I scarcely question the provision was intended by those who made it for the reclaiming of what we call fugitive slaves. Well, if you know, I think it's the law of 1850, where Northerners, if they captured escaped slaves, they had to be returned to the owners. Of course, some of those slaves and the Underground Railroad proceeding north, some going to Canada because the British government had already forbid slavery. So some blacks were going as far as Canada. Of course, some came back into New York State because it's too darn cold in Canada. So that's what some of them did. And so there's this discrepancy here to the proposition then that slaves whose cases come up within the terms of the clause shall be delivered up. Their oaths are unanimous. Now, if we make the effort in good temper, they could not, with nearly equal unanimity, frame and pass a law by which means to keep good the unanimous oath. In other words, yes, from the original intent here, any slaves that make it to the north, if they're captured, they have to be given back. That is to make sure that Southerners are reassured here, that they can keep their slaves. So why bother leaving the Union? Why bother leaving the Union? You don't have to. It's not necessary. I take the official oath today, meaning he's taken the oath of office, March 4, 1861, with no mental reservations and with no purpose to construe the Constitution or laws, again, Constitution, by any hypothetical rules. And while I do not choose now to specify particular acts of Congress as proper to be enforced, I do suggest that it is much safer for all, both in official and private stations, to conform to and abide by all those acts which stand unrepealed, and then to violate any of them, trusting to find immunity and having them held to be unconstitutional. In other words, the constitutional is sacred. We are all, whether north, south, east, west, we all have to abide by the Constitution. It is our blueprint for government. It is our base of union. And of course, the original Bill of Rights, the 10 Bill of Rights, are your protections against the infringement of government. Lincoln knows all this. We had a limited Republican government. And actually, the way the framers put this together, the Constitution is more to govern the government than it is to govern you. But then again, the Bill of Rights, those 10 protections are to protect you against the infringement of government or to protect the individual. Because as Hamilton once stated, and I think it's no, not Hamilton, it's Madison. I think it's in Federalist 51, that if people were angels, you wouldn't need government. But since people are not angels, they need to be governed. And so who governs the governed? Who governs the government? You have to create those mechanisms. Lincoln supports those mechanisms. That's what he's telling you. But how do you govern the government? Well, you set up those mechanisms. Yet in the end, who guards the Constitution? And in the end, who guards those who are in government? The people. Yet, as Madison states, you got to have checks on the people. Why? Because the founders didn't trust the common man. Hence the electors. That's another different discussion here. I hold that in contemplation of universal law and of the Constitution, the union of these, and this is again union, the union of these states is perpetual. Perpetuity is implied, if not expressed, in the fundamental law of all national governments. It is safe to assert that no government proper ever had provision in its organic law for its own termination. That will come down the road here with the Weimar Republic in Article 48, that if the country was in dire straits or threat, or the economy was falling apart, let's say, leading to disruption, riots, so on and so forth, that the president of the country could check the power of the Diet or the Reichstag and bring up himself chancellors to run the government. That's gonna happen in 1930 in Germany. That'll be the end of the Weimar Republic. Continue to execute all the express provisions of our national constitution, and the Union will endure forever. Interesting. It being impossible to destroy it except by some action not provided for in the instrument itself. That's what he's saying that the secession of the Confederacy is. However, one thing is important here. You know, he favors defending the Constitution, which means that defends Union. Yet, interesting, this is 1861. Go back to 1816 when Thomas Jefferson wrote a letter to Samuel Kershaw. And I believe he's admitting that the founders made a mistake because we've never done this. We've applied amendments to the Constitution. That we've done. But we haven't had what Jefferson implies here. He says every 19 or 20 years, there ought to be a constitutional convention, in other words, every generation, to update the document to the present generation. Because as Jefferson also says in that letter, the present belongs to the living, not the dead. Well, the dead's nothing. The dead don't mean anything anymore. They're gone. They're gone. But the document ought to be brought up, ought to be acclimated to the present generation. This ought to be done every 19, 20 years. In other words, a constitutional convention. We've never had that. Not being a stupid man, Jefferson understood that the country in 1787, the year that the Constitutional Convention had been had, was not going to be the same country in 1857. And it's not the same country now. Yet Lincoln is telling you he's going to defend the precepts of the Constitution, come hell or high water, no matter what. Union is perpetual. As long as we maintain the Constitution, as long as everyone in the North, South, East, West are represented in this Constitution, in other words, the federal government bolstered by the Constitution, we're going back to what George Washington inferred here. Interesting. This is what George Washington states, and Lincoln concurs with this. Now listen to this. Interwoven is the love of liberty with every ligament of your hearts. Note the language, every ligament of your hearts. That kind of use of the language you weren't getting the last 4 years. No recommendation of mine is necessary to fortify or confirm this attachment. In other words, he thinks he's preaching to the choir, George Washington does in 1796. The unity of government, again, you're going to hear this word again with Lincoln. The unity of government which constitute you one people is also now dear to you. It is justly so, for it is the main pillar in that edifice of your real independence. The support of your tranquility at home, your peace abroad, your safety, or your prosperity. Get a note of that, get a load of that one, prosperity. What do you think Lincoln is saying here by not wanting to take property and not wanting to go against slavery in the South? Their prosperity. He's telling him, he's guaranteeing it. Well, now go back to Washington. The very liberty for which you highly prize. Interesting here. The last thing the last reference here from Washington is of your prosperity, of which your very liberty, which you highly prize. Prosperity. The country was formed on economic liberty. That means property. Well, what is Lincoln testifying here? Property. We're no threat to your property. Republican government's not threat to your property. The Republican Party is not. Your property is sacred. And what are slaves considered here, folks? Property. They're not considered citizens. Keep in mind, about approximately 9 million people below the Mason-Dixon line in 1861, 3,938,000, just under 4 million, were considered slaves, or those in that hellish purgatory of bondage. Interesting, fascinating. And I find this interesting too. Resolve. that the maintenance inviolate of the rights of the states, and especially the right of each state to order and control its own domestic institutions. Here we go again. He's trying to appeal to Southerners. Your domestic institutions, especially in the states, are sacred to you. You order them, you organize them, you run them. We don't want to interfere with that. We don't want to interfere with that. Fascinating. To control its own domestic institutions, each state, states' rights, is essential to that balance of power on which the perfection and endurance of our political fabric depend. The bases are in the states. Now that's interesting because you can make the case here, maybe not, well, maybe even today. There's a discussion for you. What do people in South Carolina have in common with people in Massachusetts? Union, a federal government to which they both elect officials to. Back in 1776, when you're putting together that unanimous Declaration of the 13 United States of America, that document that was that cohesion for revolution, and they're not states, they're colonies, and they jealously guarded their independence. So you can go back to that. Well, what does somebody in South Carolina have in common with Massachusetts? They are going to overcome that. They are going to overcome that to kick the crown out of here. And you're going to have 56 signers from the 13 colonies to back this up. Now you're beginning to get that union. He's trying to preserve that union. This is what Lincoln's trying to do. They're no longer colonies, they're states. And to maintain union, you've got to stay together. That's why the Republican Party is not a threat to the Southerners. Free citizens. There is some difference of opinion whether this clause about citizenry should be enforced by national or by state authority. Again, we're broaching here we're broaching states' rights. But surely that the difference is not a very material one. If the slave is to be surrendered, it can be but little consequence to him or to others, by which authority it is done. In other words, again, a slave is property. Lincoln is not stupid, he understands this. And so a slave act of North is what? Return to the slave owner. This is what he's trying to soothe this out for these people, is what he's trying to do here. I take this oath today with no mental reservations and no purpose to construe the Constitution or laws by hypocritical rules. And while I do not choose now to specify particular acts of Congress as proper to be enforced, I do suggest that it will be much safer for all, both in official and private stations, to conform to and abide by all these acts which stand unrepealed, than to violate any of them, trusting to find immunity having them held as unconstitutional. The Constitution, again, is sacred. It is the basic of your union. And like George Washington, if you love with every ligament of your heart this union, it can protect your way of life. It can protect your freedom of worship. It can protect your life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, and your prosperity. Again, we go to the last one here. Again, he says this is perpetual. This is what George Washington was saying. As long as you respect union, this can't die. And yet, what do you have now? Factionalism in the country? I can imagine what Washington and Lincoln would say about that today. Lincoln states, descending from these general principles, we find that the proposition that in legal contemplation the union is perpetual, confirmed by the history of the union itself. The union is much older than the Constitution. That's the case he's making. By the Articles of Association. How many here have ever heard that? In fact, I copied it out tonight. I have it right here in my archives. Articles of Association came out October 20, 1774. It was, even though you have this growing penchant toward revolution, many of these delegates, and they rattle off the colonies here, still have loyalty to the crown. This is October 20, 1774. They just want a little bit of a better deal. But Articles of Association, October 20, 1774, yet less than a year later, and I know why they don't teach this one in school. You know, the unanimous Declaration of the 13 United States of America comes out July 4, 1776. You know that. You know that. Of course, we don't really resort to it anymore. Every 4th of July, you go to any picnic outing or gathering, it's subsumed in beer, beans, and baseball. But if sandwiched in between the Articles of Association, 1774, and your Declaration of Independence, and I know why this middle document is not brought up because of the title. It came out on July 6, 1775, and I urge you to read it. It was signed off on by John Hancock, President of the Continental Congress, on July 6, 1775. It's called The Causes and Necessity of Taking Up Arms, because now some of your founders have reached that realization here that waving flags, walking the streets, writing letters to the editor, or even petitioning the Parliament or Crown ain't working. It's time to grab a gun and kill your fellow man. That's where we have to go. That was the correct course to take, and the one most desired by a growing many at this point. And so it's interesting, these documents, he says, forges union. And they do, especially the Declaration of Independence. It's beginning to forge that union. And this is what he's referring to. Recall your history and you will maintain union. Christmas sakes, he sounds like Thomas Jefferson here. And he's right and right. In so doing, there needs to be no bloodshed or violence. He's petitioning these people not to go to the gun to maintain union or dismember the union. And there shall be none unless it is forced upon national authority. Now we get to the meat here. He's telling the Southerners, we are not going to start this. You will. By splitting the union. By splitting the union. He's telling them now they have nothing to fear from the North. Although, let's be honest here, some of the Southerners do have a leg to stand on here. Prior to the American Revolution, Southerners had a lot of complaints against British banks and British businessmen for usurping the Southern plantation owners. This is how they feel about Northern banks and Northern business owners, big businessmen. Let's face it, as the country forms, where is most of the industry? Up north. Where is the majority of the banking system? Up north. Who's going to control the majority of the resources? Up north. Who has the majority of the population? The North. In fact, the South will have, if you count the blacks, a population of 9 million. The North, 22, 23 million. Interesting when you look at this, and Lincoln understands this as well. In 1860, the Southerners will produce 76,000 tons of iron ore and steel. You know how much the North's going to produce in 1860? 2,500,000 tons. Who do you think is going to win this industrialized war? A bunch of farmers or a nation of wrench turners? I mean, let's be real here. We're going to conventional industrialized total war at this point. And so, having said that, the power confided in me as president, the will be to use, hold, and occupy and process property and places belonging to the government. In other words, private property, your private property is sacred. But as the president, operating under the precepts of the United States Constitution, our blueprint for government, he will protect property, especially that property overseen by the government. Well, people elect their officials, correct, to the House of Representatives. Well, keep in mind, at this point, you couldn't elect your senators. You can't elect your senators until 1913. Your senators were applied for you by state legislators who back then you voted for. That was considered another sop to states' rights when the Republic was formed. Your 2-year rep, you can vote for them from the get-go. Senators, you could not till 1913, when that amendment was applied to the Constitution. The presidents, yes, you could vote for it, but of course there's the electors as a check on you because the founders didn't trust you, and rightly so. But he's saying he will defend not only the Constitution, but property overseen by the government. Well, elected officials, right? Representing the interests of the people. If the people feel their country is threatened, what happens? They're going to join the Army and the Navy to protect that property. That means what? They are under the umbrella of the federal government. Because at this point, you are going to see strong central government, which operates through the precepts of the entire country. So that private property now becomes what? Property to be protected by the federal government. You put those people in office, you expect that. What do you think they expected in World War II? Joining the Army and the federal government, you are protecting not only government parks, folks, but you're also protecting your home, your farm, and your town. And you're going to do that by joining the Army when it's required. This is what Lincoln is telling them. But they're going to start the war, not us. And he'll be vindicated here 5 weeks later at Fort Sumter. He'll be vindicated. And he'll get more than 75,000 volunteers. Grant says by the first year there were 400,000 men in the Army. Now, interesting here, what he goes on, it intimates here, constitutionally defend and maintain itself. That's what the Constitution does. But it can maintain itself, but only if the people get involved. And in this instance, it's going to be what? Involved in a war. You know, we're not going down to vote for a resolution. We're not passing a new law. We are now trying to preserve union, preserve the government, preserve the nation. Because Lincoln also has another fear. If the Southerners are able to successfully secede and successfully set up this Confederacy, will another section of the country want to dismember itself from the Union? Will that lead us to be a target for what's growing in Europe again here, the colonial powers, the British? Keep in mind, Napoleon III is now the leader of France, and he's trying to put France back on the global level to be a bona fide power. How about Czarist Russia? Interesting, Czarist Russia, 1861. You know, when the war starts, well, the Russians understand this. Czarist Russia is one of Lincoln's biggest boosters from Europe. Don't lose this war, Abe. Maintain the country as whole. Why? Because they see the growth of this country, and Czarist Russia sees us as a potential ally against the British and the French. They don't want us to lose the war. Fascinating what's coming in from outside the country here. Before entering upon so grave a matter as the destruction of our national fabric again or union, with all its benefits, its memories, and its hopes, would it be not wise to ascertain precisely why we need it? Will you hazard so much a desperate step while there is any possibility that any portion of the ills you fly from have no real existence? In other words, your fears are unfounded. That's what he's telling them. Sounds like what? Roosevelt? The only thing you have to fear is fear itself? Of course. He says, it is true then that any right plainly written in the Constitution has been denied? I think not. Happily, the human mind is so constituted that no party can reach to the audacity of doing this. Think, if you can, of a single instance in which a plainly written provision in the Constitution has ever been denied. That's what he's challenging them. And if by the mere force of numbers a majority should deprive a minority of any clearly written constitutional right, it might, in a moral point of view, justify a revolution. Certainly would, if not right, would be a vital one. With regards to that, you know, Lincoln even brings up the fact, and he does, and in fact, I've brought this up in other talks because of the gravity of this statement. You know, your founders gave you that revolution. This is what the Southerners think they're exercising too. The founders gave you your revolutionary right in that Declaration of Independence. That if a government becomes too despotic, too authoritarian, it is not only your right as your duty to throw it off. Now, how you do that should be up to you. For as Lincoln once wrote, get this, remember this, remember what Lincoln stated, the tree of liberty is watered with the blood of patriots and tyrants. Lincoln mirrors that, echoes this. He states at one point here, fascinating what he states here. That this country and its institutions belong to those who inhabit it. Whenever they shall grow weary of the existing government, they can exercise their constitutional right of amending it or their revolutionary right to dismember or overthrow it. Next time you go to a Republican meeting, recite that, and I'm sure it won't be long before they show you the door. Again, going back to this idea of unity, this idea of love of country. I just want to bring in here, into this conversation here, Ulysses S. Grant. This idea of preservation of the Union, preserving the Constitution, and this is even where Grant goes. This I find fascinating with Grant, because keep in mind, you know, this war is going to turn out to be an industrialized war, especially after 1863, after Gettysburg. You're going to see this penchant by people like Grant, Sherman, Sheridan, Phil Sheridan. They're not going to want to fight huge battles. They're going to attack the economy, and a lot of that is Sherman. In other words, what I'm telling you, like Lincoln, like Grant, you know, it's not. We're all products of our time. The question is, do you know your time? Grant did, so does Sherman did. Wars become economic, so you attack the economy. But this is what Grant, and bolstering Lincoln, and even maybe going beyond Lincoln, says. This is fascinating. This is Ulysses S. Grant. The Confederates proclaim themselves aliens. This is what he says is going to take to preserve the Constitution. And thereby disbarred themselves, get a load of this, thereby disbarred themselves of all right to claim protection under the Constitution of the United States, becoming like people of any other foreign nation who make war upon an independent state. They played into his hands here when they attacked Fort Sumter. And so what Lincoln is offering here to the Southerners with this inaugural address, you have nothing to fear from the Republican Party. You have nothing to fear from Republican government. Protection of your property, protection of your prosperity, protection of your way of life is indeed protected by the Constitution. You elect people to represent you in government. Why are you seceding for? Why are you tearing it apart? Our union is our strength. And so the Confederacy, which is, by the way, a revolution, but from the right. That revolution was not for states' rights in the end, and it was not to preserve the Constitution. It was to preserve the primacy of position by the Southern aristocracy. Who do you think is going to fight most of this war? The poor farmers. Typical, like anything else. Like anything else. It's the farmers who will fight this war. And the farmers and the Southern Army will have a higher desertion rate than the Northern Army. So what do you think's happening here by 1864, 1865? And so Lincoln, preserving Union, is trying to persuade the South not to secede, because we are not a threat in the end. We're all Americans, we're all part of this Union. Yet, when you get beyond this, and they do go, Lincoln will fight to preserve the Union. He will lead that effort to preserve the Union, even to the extent of rounding up, and he becomes virtually a pseudo-dictator. So did Jefferson Davis, by the way. He becomes a pseudo-dictator. Not that he really wanted to, but he exercised power. And many of those who exercised opposition, keep in mind, during the 4-year war, Lincoln will have 15,000 Americans jailed. And they won't be tried, most won't be tried in civil courts, but in military courts. Many will be released. Many will be released. But he will round up in jail 15,000 people. Fascinating what's going to happen here after this inaugural address. It's fascinating. And this is all part of your American history. Interesting. My countrymen, one and all, think calmly and well. Again, he's appealing. He's appealing to the people's better nature. My countrymen, one and all, think calmly and well upon this whole subject. In other words, disunion. Nothing valuable can be lost by taking time. He's doing anything here to stall. If there be an object in a hurry, to hurry any of you in hot haste to a step which you will never take deliberately, then don't. In other words, don't be pushed. Think. That object will be frustrated by taking time, but no good object can be frustrated by it. In your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, and not in mine, is the momentous issue of civil war. The government will not assail you. You can have no conflict without yourselves being the aggressors. He's stepping back. He's taking his hands off the lever here. They who want disunion are the ones that are going to have to foster aggression, and they do at Fort Sumter. You have an oath registered in heaven to destroy the government. He says, you have no oath registered in heaven to destroy the government, while I shall have the most solemn one to preserve, protect, and defend it. Here we go, bringing God into this. How many leaders do that? Even Hitler did, which I found fascinating. Providence deems us that we will run this country and then we will get rid of the Jewish people, so on and so forth. That's something else. So this inaugural address, which is, by the way, a pretty good example of the use of the English language, unlike what we were getting the last 4 years, is worth the read, as is George Washington's farewell address. But the underlying message here from Lincoln was that the South had nothing to fear from the North. Of course, that's open to discussion. And it had nothing to fear from the Republican Party. It had nothing to fear from Republican government. After all, the Southerners were big practitioners of Republican limited government. But don't wreck the Union. Don't wreck unity. Keep the country whole. And you don't do that with disunion, which is why I always call the Civil War the revolt of the planters. And this goes back, folks. I know slavery is a big part of this, but slavery was that engine of agrarian capitalism. And in the beginning of the country, you had the Jeffersonian notion of the agrarian as the salt of the earth. That will be prostituted by the slave owners. That those who dig in the dirt are the best practitioners of Republican government, the best defenders of Republican government because they dig in the dirt, and we were founded on economic liberty. Not this liberty, freedom, democracy stuff. That's bedtime story. As opposed to the Hamiltonian notion of industrialization of finance, because Hamilton knows the Industrial Revolution is snowballing. Jefferson did too. Yet, those are the two doctrines that are going to lead us to war. One had to take primacy here. And guess which one will win in 1865? It's not going to be the Jeffersonian notion. It will be the Hamiltonian notion. Slavery was part of this. So it's interesting in between that, Lincoln with his inaugural address. Again, it's a fascinating document to read, and I urge you to read it.